The accountant arrived before the crows. The rebel wounded were still being dragged from the mud of the Silurus River when Marcus Licinius Crassus ordered the tables set up. Not command tables, not victory tables, wooden writing desks. His scribes walked between corpses with wax tablets in hand, stepping over the dying, kneeling beside the breathing, scratching notations with bronze styluses. Smoke from the pyres of his own legionaries drifted in gray sheets across the field. The styluses kept moving. Every captured rebel became a line in a ledger. Every branded forearm, every torn tunic, every shattered ribcage was a figure. A market price, a depreciation, a recoverable unit. The battle was finished. The audit had started. But Crassus had a problem. Inside the cages of captured rebels stood thousands of women. To the richest man in the Roman Republic, a man who had built his fortune by buying burning houses from terrified owners, women who had carried spears for 2 years were not trophies. They were spoiled stock. Sell them all at once, and prices crash from Capua to the Aventine docks. Feed them through the winter, and they consume grain without producing a coin. Slaughter them, and the asset evaporates. A clean problem with no clean answer. And Crassus, above any Roman of his century, despised waste. What he designed next was not vengeance, it was not justice, it was not even cruelty, as most minds understand the word. 6,000 bodies nailed along 200 miles of the Via Appia became the most precise transaction the ancient world ever witnessed. A business move from a man who had never confused emotion with arithmetic. Those people were not being killed. They were being converted from unsellable flesh into the one commodity Crassus could still profit from: fear. Manufactured, weatherproof, self-replicating fear. This is the story of how Rome's wealthiest predator took the ashes of the largest slave uprising in history and turned 6,000 corpses into the most effective advertisement his civilization ever produced. Drop a comment telling us the city and country you're watching from right now. We want to map where our audience lives. And if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button. It costs you nothing, and it carries this project forward. You're watching Romanus, your home of the Roman Empire on YouTube. White chalk on the soles of the feet. That was how a human being entered the Roman market. The dealers, the venality, rubbed it in before sunrise so buyers could spot fresh imports across a crowded plaza. New stock, unbroken. Not yet trained to the rhythm of a household. The chalk was a signal flag stamped onto living flesh. It told a buyer, "This one has not been used yet." It told the person wearing it nothing at all, because their opinion was not part of the transaction. The dealers worked under awnings of dyed linen near the Temple of Castor in the Forum, and on the slopes leading down to the Sciepta Julia. They sprinkled the platforms with sawdust to soak up the urine and the sweat. The smell, Seneca later wrote in one of his letters, was a smell you could taste at the back of the throat 3 streets away. Stand back from the scene and look at what the chalk really was. It was the first line of an accounting record that would track that person from the platform to the grave. Every tooth pried open by an inspector, every bicep squeezed for tone, every old scar the dealer had to explain. All of it formed a vocabulary. The vocabulary of appraisal. Roman slave markets were not markets in any sentimental sense of the word. They were commodity exchanges. The commodity walked on 2 legs and breathed. Captives taken from Pontus after the wars against Mithridates wore signs marked with a P. Captives from Gaul wore a G. Captives from Thrace, where Spartacus himself had been born, wore a T burned into wood or, in some recorded cases, burned into the skin behind the ear. Rome's late republic ran on this trade, the way a modern factory runs on electricity. By 73 BC, when Spartacus broke out of Capua, the slave population of Italy sat somewhere between 2 and 3 million people, 1 in every 3 human beings on the peninsula. Some historians push the figure higher. The historian Appian, writing in the 2nd century AD, with access to records now lost, gives numbers that suggest the count was rising every year through the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, driven by Roman victories in the east. After Aemilius Paulus crushed the Macedonians at Pydna in 168 BC, he reportedly sold 150,000 Epirot captives into slavery in a single transaction. After the fall of Carthage in 146 BC, 50,000 more. The wars filled the markets filled the estates filled the ledgers. The latifundia, those sprawling agricultural holdings that had eaten the Italian countryside over the previous century, operated on slave hands so thoroughly that the free peasant farmer had nearly vanished as a category. Tiberius Gracchus had warned about exactly this collapse in 133 BC and had been clubbed to death on the steps of the Capitol for his trouble, his body dumped in the Tiber along with 300 of his supporters. The Senate, the equestrian order, the great banking houses of the Forum, their wealth was not counted primarily in coin or in acres. It was counted in bodies. Bought bodies. Branded bodies. Bodies you could deploy, sell, or burn if the math demanded it. This was the world Marcus Licinius Crassus was raised inside, and it was the world he understood more thoroughly than any Roman of his generation. Crassus did not begin life rich. The family fortune was confiscated during the Marian Terror of 87 BC, and his father Publius, who had served as consul and as censor, was killed. Plutarch says he took his own life rather than fall into the hands of Cinna's men. One of his brothers died in the same purge. The young Crassus, then about 28, fled south with 3 friends and 10 slaves to the coast of Spain, where he hid for 8 months in a coastal cave on the estate of a man named Vibius Paciaecus. Plutarch records that Paciaecus, suspecting nothing of the fugitive's identity at first, sent a servant down to the cave each day with food, and once with 2 female slaves for the comfort of the men in hiding. Crassus emerged from that cave a different man. What he carried out of the wreckage of his family was a particular kind of mind. A mind that processed humans the way a grain merchant processes wheat, by weight, by grade, by yield per unit. He raised a small private force in Spain, crossed back into Italy in 83 BC, and rode into Rome on the coattails of Sulla's victory. He arrived just in time for the proscriptions. Proscription was political murder dressed in the gown of law. A name went onto a public list pinned to a board in the Forum. Everything that name owned, the townhouse on the Palatine, the country estate in Latium, the slaves, the wife's inheritance, the children's future, became forfeit, sold off at prices that only existed because the seller was legally compelled to sell and the buyer faced no competition that mattered. Plutarch records that Sulla eventually grew angry with Crassus for adding the name of a man named Quinctus to the lists purely so that Crassus could acquire his estate. The friendship cooled after that. Crassus did not stop buying. He bought prescribed properties in volume. He bought them on a schedule. He bought them the way a man with a clear eye and no embarrassment about what he sees simply buys. Then he built Rome's first private fire brigade. This is the detail that opens his entire mind to you. Rome burned constantly. The city was a maze of timber-framed insulae, packed shoulder to shoulder, with no spacing, no sanitation, no fire breaks, no urban planning of any honest kind. The poet Juvenal would later write that the 3rd floor of his apartment building was already smoking by the time the man on the ground floor noticed the flames. When a building caught, Crassus dispatched his brigade, 500 trained slaves with buckets, hooks, and axes, recorded by Plutarch in the life of Crassus, to the scene. They did not fight the fire, they stood beside it. While the flames climbed the upper floors, Crassus, or one of his agents, walked up to the owner and made an offer. The owner watched his investment burn while haggling over a price. Once the contract was agreed, always at a savage discount because the asset was visibly dying, Crassus's men finally turned their water on the flames. He also bought the neighboring buildings on the same terms, because their owners were watching the fire spread and were now equally motivated sellers. He then rebuilt the property using slave craftsmen from his own holdings, which cost him almost nothing, and rented or sold the restored insula at full market rate. By the time Plutarch wrote his biography, the historian estimated that the majority of Rome at one point belonged to Crassus. The operation was so naked that even his contemporaries struggled to put a name on it. There was no law against it. There was barely a word for it. Crassus had invented predatory capitalism in a civilization that had not yet built the language to describe what he was doing. The slaves running his brigade were trained specialists. In his ledger, they were also one of his most valuable asset classes. To understand how Crassus thought about slaves, you have to switch off every empathic reflex and step inside the arithmetic of the patrician class. A female slave, an ancilla, purchased on the block entered a household with an assigned function: domestic worker, wool spinner, cook, wet nurse, ornatrix, one of the women who arranged the mistress's hair every morning under the dim glow of an oil lamp before the master rose for the day. Her market value was not fixed. It dropped with age, with injury, with illness. It rose with training. It could be partially recovered through her reproductive output, because any child born to a slave woman was itself a slave, owned by the same master from the first breath, requiring no purchase price and carrying no acquisition cost. These house-born slaves were called vernae, and in the long view of Roman slave economics, they were the highest grade asset a wealthy household could hold. A verna had never been free, had no memory of another life, had no village to dream about, had grown up inside the master's walls, learning the geography of the household the way a free child learns the layout of a hometown. They learned the back stairs first, because the back stairs were where slaves moved. They learned which floorboards creaked outside the master's bedroom. They learned the name of every cup on every shelf in the triclinium, because forgetting one earned a beating. Imported slaves resisted. They ran. They carried the memory of a mother, a husband, a coastline. A verna carried only the household, conditioned from infancy to understand the world as it actually was from inside their skin, a place where they were property and survival ran through obedience. This is not to claim vernae never rebelled. The record of Roman slavery is studded with private acts of defiance from every category. But statistically, vernae were the stable investment. The elite knew it. Deliberate breeding programs inside large estates were not exotic practice. They were standard asset management. Columella, in his agricultural manual De Re Rustica, recommends granting a female slave her freedom after she has produced 3 living children, on the grounds that the prospect of manumission improves her willingness to bear more. The Roman matron who stabbed her ornatrix with a hairpin, the long bronze accus used to pin elaborate styles in place, has come down through history as a small icon of Roman domestic cruelty. Juvenal wrote a satire about her. Ovid mentioned her in the Ars Amatoria, warning his readers' future mistresses to keep their hands off the help. And she was real. But from the perspective of someone like Crassus, she was also a poor manager. A wounded ornatrix flinches and ruins the next morning's hair. The puncture wound might infect, dropping her working days. Repeated psychological terror degrades her performance across every assigned task. A hairpin in the shoulder, on the balance sheet, is an inefficient form of discipline. You are damaging a depreciating asset to vent a personal mood. Crassus would not have done it. Crassus would have sold the girl at the next Nundini and bought a sharper one. This distinction is the whole point. Most Roman slaveholders were cruel, the way anyone with unchecked power over another human being is cruel, impulsively, emotionally, in the heat of an unpleasant morning. Crassus was cruel the way a market is cruel, without temper, without satisfaction, with nothing but the cold geometry of return on investment. The slave market itself was the architecture of that geometry. On the Nundinae, the 8-day market cycle, the dealers set up in the open air near the temples, on the steps of the forum, in the designated commercial spaces of the city. The big foreign cargoes came in through the harbor at Puteoli on the Bay of Naples, where the docks were lined with holding pens roofed in straw. From Puteoli, the chains marched north along the Via Appia, sometimes 1,000 people in a single column, escorted by armed men on hired horses. Slaves stood on wooden blocks raised above the crowd for visibility, the way produce is raised on a shelf to catch the eye. Fresh imports wore the chalk. Older stock often wore wooden placards around the neck listing skills, defects, and country of origin. Roman commercial law required disclosure of certain conditions: illness, epilepsy, a recorded history of running. A slave sold with hidden defects gave the buyer grounds for return under the aedil's edict. A history of running was called a vitium, a defect. It dropped the price the way flood damage drops the price of a used carriage. Buyers understood what the word meant. It meant the previous owner had not finished the job. Some interior resistance still lived inside the asset. A repeat runner was sometimes branded on the forehead with the letter F, for fugitivus, so that the next buyer could see at a glance what they were getting. Some buyers specifically hunted vitium stock because the discount more than paid for the additional management. Others avoided it. The market had a grade for every condition a body could carry. The legal architecture protecting all of this was a quiet masterpiece of patrician self-interest. The Senatus Consultum Silanianum was not formally enacted until AD 10, after the events in this story, but the principle it codified had been operating as standard practice for generations. Tacitus in the Annals records a case from AD 61 in which the prefect of the city, Pedanius Secundus, was murdered by one of his own slaves. The Senate debated the matter for an afternoon, and then ordered all 400 slaves in the household, men, women, children, executed in accordance with the old custom. A crowd gathered in the streets of Rome to block the executions, sympathetic to the children especially, and the Emperor Nero himself had to send soldiers to line the route along which the condemned were marched to their deaths. The rule worked like this: if a master was murdered by a slave, every slave in the household within hearing distance of the killing was executed. Not tried, not interviewed, executed. The justification was that slaves had a standing duty to protect their owner and to raise an alarm at the first sign of danger. Any failure to do so, regardless of knowledge or involvement, was treated as complicity. Stop reading this as law. It was not law in any meaningful sense of the word. It was a financial guarantee written in human bodies. What the principle actually accomplished was binding every slave's survival directly to the master's survival. Kill your master, and you kill yourself. Kill your master, and you kill the cook who was asleep on the 3rd floor. The old gardener who had served the family for 40 years. The wet nurse cradling the master's infant in the next room. The boy who carried water from the cistern. You kill them all, and you kill them publicly. because the execution of a household's entire slave population was a civic event. A demonstration aimed not just at the surviving slaves of that house, but at every slave in Rome who would hear about it before the next market day. This was the Roman state functioning as an insurance underwriter for its richest citizens. The policy was straightforward. Your investment is protected at the price of collective terror. The premium was paid in blood, not yours, theirs. Now, take that whole structure, the chalk on the feet, the breeding ledgers, the public mass executions, the financial logic threaded through every interaction between owner and owned, and picture the moment in 73 BC when the gates of a gladiatorial school in Capua swung open and roughly 70 men walked out carrying kitchen knives and roasting spits stolen from the cook's fire. This was not, in that first hour, a catastrophe. It was an embarrassment, a private security breach at a facility owned by Lentulus Batiatus, who ran a ludus on the outskirts of Capua, one of the wealthiest cities in southern Italy. Capua, in the late Republic, was a city of perfume markets and bronze workshops, of gladiator schools running side by side with bathhouses where the trainers came at the end of the day to soak the bruises out of their arms. The ludus itself was a square block of cells around an open training yard, the cells locked at night, the food prepared in a common kitchen at the back. The men who walked out were trained killers, which was precisely why they had been bought in the first place. But 70 men with kitchen utensils is a policing matter, not a military one. The local magistrates handled it as such. They dispatched a praetor named Gaius Claudius Glaber with 3,000 hastily raised militia from Capua to round the runaways up. Glaber climbed the lower slopes of Mount Vesuvius, found the rebels camped on a wide flat ledge near the summit, accessible by a single narrow path, and set up a blockade at that path. He intended to starve them out. He was confident enough that he did not bother fortifying his own camp. Plutarch says the rebels wove ladders from wild grapevines that grew along the rim of the crater, climbed down a sheer cliff on the far side of the mountain, came around behind Glaber's position in the dark, and slaughtered the militia in their tents. They took the weapons, the armor, the horses, and the standards. They retreated in confusion, having lost their gear to fighters who promptly armed themselves with proper Roman steel. The second detachment was larger. It was commanded by another praetor, Publius Varinius. It ended worse. Spartacus drew Varinius into a series of skirmishes across the Campanian countryside, picked off his subordinates one by one, captured his lictors, and finally took the praetor's personal horse and his official insignia in a night assault on the Roman camp. By the time the Roman state acknowledged that this had stopped being a policing matter and started being a war, the 70 had become tens of thousands. Slaves from the latifundia walked off the estates and joined the camp. Herdsmen who lived half-wild in the southern hills came down out of the Sila and the Lucanian highlands carrying boar spears. Freedmen with old grievances came in. The rebel column moved through southern Italy the way fire moves through a stand of dry pine, and behind it, the entire Roman slave system simply dissolved. Slaves walked off threshing floors. They walked out of workshops. They walked out of the back doors of villas. The chalk on the feet washed off in the first rain. The ledger entries blew away on the wind. For the Roman propertied class, this was not a rebellion. It was a market event, a catastrophic failure of the financial infrastructure their entire civilization rested on. The aggregate value of slave holdings across Italy was a sum so large that any honest attempt to translate it into modern terms collapses immediately. And that figure does not even include the estates that ran on that labor, the businesses that deployed those workers, the loans secured against that human collateral. When the slaves ran, all of it evaporated. Not gradually, not on a manageable timeline. It evaporated in real time, estate by estate, ledger by ledger, and the Senate, a legislative body composed largely of men whose wealth lived inside human property, convened in something that looked very much like panic, wearing a clean toga. They sent consul after consul south: Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus, Lucius Gellius Publicola. Both men commanded consular armies, Rome's best institutional force. Gellius scored a real victory against a breakaway faction of the rebels led by Crixus near Mount Garganus in 72 BC, and killed Crixus in the fighting, along with roughly 20,000 of his men. But Spartacus's core army survived the news. Plutarch writes that Spartacus held funeral games for Crixus afterward, forcing 300 captured Roman soldiers to fight each other to the death in pairs as gladiators. The image is precise. The Roman class system was being inverted, performed back at its inventors, in the same arena format the Romans had used to entertain themselves with the deaths of men like Spartacus for generations. Then Spartacus absorbed his losses and turned around to crush both consular armies in sequence, scattering the legions and stripping them of their eagles. The eagle was the soul of a legion. Losing one was the equivalent of watching your nation's flag burn while you stood at attention. It was humiliation the Republic's military pride could barely metabolize. The war was now in its second year. 2 consular armies destroyed. The rebel column had marched north to the foot of the Alps near Mutina, defeated the army of the proconsul Gaius Cassius Longinus on the banks of the Po, come within a day of leaving Italy altogether, and then, for reasons historians have argued over ever since, turned south again. Spartacus reportedly wanted to cross into Gaul and disperse his forces back to their original homelands. The German and Gallic contingents reportedly refused. They wanted more. They wanted to march on Rome itself. The disagreement broke the strategic unity of the rebel army, and the hesitation cost them their one clean window. In Rome that winter, the streets ran with rumors. Sallust records that the price of grain spiked sharply because the southern estates that fed the city had stopped shipping. Refugees from Campania camped in the Forum Boarium. The Senate met in extended sessions inside the Curia Hostilia. No magistrate of standing wanted the command. Pompey was occupied in Spain fighting Sertorius. Lucullus was in the east against Mithridates. Every senior consular with a presentable reputation had a reason to be elsewhere. By the winter of 72 BC, Rome needed someone new. Not another consul calculating his next election. Not another magistrate hedging his career. Not another general fighting with one eye on the battlefield and the other on the forum. They needed a man who did not care about anything except winning, because winning was the only thing in this equation that had any value to him. They needed Crassus. He had been watching, from his offices in Rome, with his accountant's eye. Doing the math, none of the consul generals had the temperament to do. He had watched 2 Roman armies burn. He had watched the slave market freeze across Campania and Lucania. He had watched estates go dark, presses go silent, grain rot in unharvested fields. Every day the rebellion lived cost him money. Not theoretically, directly. His own properties, his own credit positions, his own carefully built portfolio of human capital sat exposed on the open ground. When the Senate, out of better ideas, offered him the command with the rank of praetor and proconsular authority, he accepted. Not because Rome needed him, because he needed Rome to grant him the legal authority to do what he had already decided to do. He funded the army himself, 6 legions raised and equipped from his own treasury, because spending his own money meant no senator could tell him how to use them. No shared command, no political compromise, no oversight. The accountant from the forum had just bought himself a war. Before we cross into what Crassus actually did with that war, and the temperature drops sharply from here, consider taking your post inside the Praetorian Guard. That's this channel's inner circle, the sworn membership of viewers who stand watch over these stories instead of just passing through them. The Guard are the reason investigations of this scale exist at the depth you are watching right now. They get early access to new releases, and they carry the knowledge that this work survives because they chose to keep it alive. If you believe history told without flinching, without softening the edges, without looking away from the ledger, is worth defending, then your post is waiting. The link is in the description. Join the Guard. Now, back to Crassus, and the morning his management philosophy stopped being a metaphor. The first thing he did when he took command was kill his own men, not in battle, not by accident. His first move on assuming command was to march his 6 legions to Picenum to block Spartacus's expected northward push. There he attached the remnants of the 2 consular armies to his own force. Then he picked a unit, 500 men of one cohort under a legate named Mummius, who had disobeyed orders by engaging Spartacus's rear guard against express instruction, and decimated them. He selected by lot 1 man out of every 10, 50 men in total, and had them beaten to death in front of the rest. Plutarch describes the scene plainly. The lots were drawn from a helmet. The condemned were stripped. Their comrades, the 9 survivors out of every 10, were handed clubs and ordered to do the killing themselves. This was decimation, an ancient Roman discipline that had fallen almost entirely out of use by the late Republic because it was considered, by the standards of the time, excessive. The last recorded use before Crassus had been more than a century earlier. He brought it back deliberately. He stood under his command standard on a wooden platform raised in the middle of the camp and watched while soldiers drew lots and then killed their own comrades with clubs and stones, because that was what decimation actually was. Not a clean execution by professional headsmen, but a killing carried out by the unit itself. The community of soldiers forced to destroy a portion of itself with its own hands as punishment for a collective failure of nerve. Plutarch records that he ordered the execution carried out in full view of the entire army, drawn up in formation on 3 sides of the killing ground, so that every man who served under him would carry the image home in his sleep. The message was not subtle. It was not designed to be. The price of failure under my command is higher than the price of dying against the enemy. I have done the math. You are now more afraid of me than you are of Spartacus. Prove me right. The legions never broke again. And somewhere south of them, marching at the head of an army that had outmaneuvered every Roman force sent against it for 2 years, Spartacus received the news of the decimation and understood, perhaps for the first time, that the man hunting him now was not a general. He was something the Roman world had never sent into the field before. The women kept the army alive. This is not sentiment. It is supply chain logic, and Crassus read it the way a modern operations manager reads a critical node in a distribution network. The rebel force that had broken 2 consular armies and walked the length of Italy was not a conventional military formation. No permanent depots, no grain contracts with the Publicani, no state treasury bankrolling the armorers. What it had was a moving population, somewhere north of 100,000 people at its peak, a significant fraction of them women and children, that had developed, across 2 years of constant motion and constant threat, an unnatural capacity for keeping a fighting force on its feet with almost nothing under it. The women foraged. They walked out from the camp in organized parties at first light, baskets across their backs, knives at their belts. They knew which roots in the Lucanian hills could be boiled into something edible and which would kill a child in an afternoon. Acorns leached in running water for 3 days became flour. Wild fennel went into the broth. Pine bark, scraped from the inner trunk, kept men working through the empty weeks between raids. They organized food distribution through a population that could fill a small city. They treated wounds with what they could salvage: yarrow for bleeding, plantain leaves pressed against torn skin, wild garlic mashed into infections, cloth torn from captured Roman tunics, techniques carried out of Thrace and Gaul and the German forests that owed nothing to the Greek physicians. The Roman elite paid in gold. When the army took a town or a workshop, the women ran the inventory. They walked the storerooms. They assessed what was there: grain, bronze fittings that could be reforged into spear sockets, tanned leather, animal fat for waterproofing boots, wine for cleaning a wound that had started to smell. Plutarch and Appian both record, in their accounts of the rebel camps, that functional iron forges were running inside the moving column, producing usable weapons from scrap. Sallust, in the surviving fragments of his histories, mentions captured Roman pila being broken down and reforged into shorter cavalry spears better suited to the rebel mounts, most of which had been taken from Roman remounts after the destruction of the consular armies. The work of keeping those forges fed sat largely in the hands of women who had once worked the workshops of the estates they had walked away from. Fuel, water, coordination of labor between shifts. Some of them had spent 10 years in the metal shops of Capua and Nola, breathing iron dust, until the morning they walked out of the workshop door behind a man with a Thracian accent who told them they were free. Strip the scene down to operational arithmetic, and what Crassus saw when he looked at the rebel camp was a self-sustaining organism. The women were its immune system. They were also its reproductive capacity, and to a man who had grown rich in part on the careful management of Verna breeding inside his own estates, that detail carried a precise strategic weight. Every infant born inside that camp was a future insurgent. Every midwife who put her hand under a delivering hip was, in his ledger, an act of theft against the Republic's future labor pool. He did not want to defeat the army. He wanted to foreclose it. The difference matters. Defeating an army means breaking its capacity to fight. Foreclosing an enterprise means destroying its capacity to exist. Crassus had no interest in pushing Spartacus north and watching the rebel force scatter across Gaul, where the individuals would survive, regroup, and seed the next catastrophe a generation later. He wanted permanent settlement, full asset recovery, every escaped unit of human capital accounted for, every spark of organized resistance extinguished with a finality that would never require a follow-up campaign. He had not forgotten that the slave uprisings in Sicily under Eunice in 135 BC and under Salvius and Athenian in 104 BC had each required separate Roman armies and separate consular years to put down. He intended to end this kind of accounting entirely. This is why what he engineered in the winter of 72 BC along the toe of Italy, in the region the Romans called Bruttium, the country south of the Crathis River, the wild high country of pine forest and limestone gorges, where the goatherds still spoke an Oscan dialect older than Latin, was not a siege line in the conventional sense. It was an act of institutional violence against the concept of escape itself. Spartacus had moved his force south after the failure to cross the Alps. He had a plan: force a crossing to Sicily. The island had risen twice in the previous 70 years. The first servile war under Eunice, who had crowned himself King Antiochus and held the island for 3 years. the second under Salvius and Athenian at the end of the century, and the memory of those uprisings was still fresh in the slave barracks of the Sicilian latifundia. A landing force from Spartacus could relight the whole island in a week. The grain estates of the Leontine plain would empty in 2. The Sicilian harvest fed a substantial portion of the Roman urban poor, and a stoppage there meant bread riots in the streets of the capital within a month. Plutarch records that Spartacus opened negotiations with Cilician pirates operating out of the harbors along the southern Anatolian coast. Men who had been raiding the Tyrrhenian shipping lanes with such freedom that they had recently kidnapped 2 praetors with their retinues directly off the Italian coast. They had also, a few years earlier, taken Julius Caesar himself off the island of Pharmacusa and held him for 38 days for ransom. The pirates agreed to ferry Spartacus's force across the Strait of Messina. They took his payment, almost certainly silver stripped from captured Roman estates, and sailed away without delivering a single ship. Whether they had been bought by Gaius Verus, the corrupt governor of Sicily, who would later be prosecuted by Cicero for plundering the province on a scale that became legendary, or were simply Cilicians being Cilicians, the result was identical. Spartacus stood on a beach at the southern edge of the peninsula, looked across a narrow strip of water at Sicily, and watched his exit dissolve into the horizon. Plutarch adds that the rebels attempted improvised rafts. They lashed together casks and broken timbers with vines and tried to push across the strait at night. The current at the Strait of Messina runs hard. The tides reverse twice a day, and the rafts that left the beach did not arrive in Sicily. Most were swept south into open water. The Homeric monsters Scylla and Charybdis had been placed on those same waters by Greek sailors who knew exactly what the current did to small craft. The rebels who tried it drowned in the dark. That is when Crassus began to dig. The wall ran coast to coast across the neck of Brutium. Plutarch gives the dimensions, and they are worth pausing on. A ditch first, 300 stadia long, which works out to roughly 35 miles, 15 feet wide, 15 feet deep, and then a rampart behind it. A raised earthwork the height of a standing man, topped with sharpened palisade stakes. Crassus put his 6 legions onto the line. They worked in shifts. The legionaries dug while their comrades stood under arms in formation along the working edge, watching the southern tree line for the assault that everyone expected, and that came, eventually, more than once. The pace left men sleeping where they dropped at sundown, the soil of southern Italy frozen at night that winter, hands cracked open across the knuckles from the cold and the spade handles. Frontinus, writing his manual on military strategy a century later, lists the Brutium Wall among the classic field engineering operations of Roman history. He cites it as the model for how to seal a numerically superior enemy inside terrain of your own choosing. 35 miles of fortification in a few weeks. When it was finished, the rebel force was sealed inside a shrinking box. No exit south to the sea. No exit north without crossing the ditch, the rampart, and 6 legions standing in formation behind it. The foragers who had kept the column fed for 2 years now operated inside a closing perimeter. The estates of Brutium were stripped within days. After that, there was nothing. The villages had been emptied. The grain stores were empty. The livestock had been eaten down to the last goat. Plutarch and Appian both record cases of cannibalism inside the enclosure before the winter ended, though the sources differ on the scale. Appian mentions that the bodies of those who died of starvation were not always given proper rites. The cold of late February pressed down on a population that had stopped producing body heat the way a fed population produces it. Mothers stopped lactating. Infants died first. The old followed. Spartacus attempted the wall. He tried at night first. The men carried bundled brushwood, dirt-filled baskets, even the bodies of their own dead. Plutarch is specific on this last detail, and threw them into a section of the ditch to build a crossing surface. They drove captured Roman prisoners into the ditch at sword point ahead of them to take the first volleys from the rampart. Plutarch records that Spartacus forced part of his force across in the dark, before Crassus's response could be brought to bear. The breakthrough was real. It was also partial. The narrow corridor of crossed ditch could not pass the entire mass of people behind the rebel lines. The women, the children, the wounded, the elderly, the non-combatants who had walked away from estates 2 years ago carrying nothing but their freedom and had kept walking. A significant portion of the rebel population remained inside the box, even after the front of the army broke out. The force was now split, half across the wall, half still trapped inside it. The Senate, meanwhile, was losing patience with Crassus. Cassius Dio records that as the winter dragged on, the Senate voted to recall Pompey from Spain. Pompey had just crushed the Sertorian War and was already on the march back across the Alps with a battle-hardened army. The Senate also wrote to Marcus Terentius Varro Lucullus, brother of the more famous Lucullus, ordering him to bring his Macedonian legions down from the Adriatic coast to assist. The reinforcements were on the way. Crassus understood what this meant. If Pompey arrived in Italy before the rebellion was finished, Pompey would write the final chapter, and Pompey would take the credit. Crassus had spent his own money on 6 legions and built a 35-mile wall in a winter campaign. And now there was a real possibility that another man would walk into the Senate and receive the laurel for ending the war. This is the moment Crassus began to move with speed. He pushed his northern force after the rebels who had broken out and caught them at a lake. The ancient sources do not agree on which. In southern Lucania, he destroyed them. 12,000 dead, according to Livy's later epitome. Plutarch records the gruesome detail that only 2 of the dead were found with wounds in the back. Every other body had been hit from the front. The men had fought facing their killers. Spartacus fell back south with the bulk of his remaining fighting men and turned to face Crassus in the only currency he had left to spend: open battle. There is a version of the final engagement that focuses entirely on Spartacus himself. The charge directly at Crassus's command position, the 2 centurions he cut down before he was surrounded and brought down. The body never recovered from the field because the carnage on that ground was beyond identification. Appian gives that account. Plutarch echoes it and adds that Spartacus had killed his own horse before the charge, declaring that if he won the day, he would take a better horse from the Romans, and if he lost it, he would not need a horse at all. It is true as far as it carries, but it tells the day from the wrong angle for what we are tracking here. To see what actually happened on the plain near the headwaters of the Silurus River in the spring of 71 BC, you have to look at the men who arrived with ropes. Roman cavalry in a fight of this kind carried the standard equipment: javelins, the long cavalry sword called the spatha, the round shield that allowed close work from horseback. But Crassus had given his horse units a second mission objective for the day, and for that mission they carried rope. Long coils of it hung from saddle horns and slung across the necks of the mounts. The plan was not pure annihilation. The plan was partial recovery. The cavalry were not just fighting. They were harvesting. The infantry took the main assault. The starved rebel force came at them with the kind of desperation that has nothing to do with hope, and the legionaries under Crassus's new discipline absorbed it with the kind of mechanical precision that has nothing to do with morale. These were not the men who had broken before Spartacus in earlier campaigns. These were soldiers who had watched their own comrades clubbed to death in the camp at Piccenum on Crassus's order. They held the line because the line was now the safer position. They pushed. They folded the rebel formation back on itself the way a butcher folds a carcass, without wasted motion, without temperament. The Roman gladius, the short stabbing sword, was a workshop tool in their hands. They drove it forward at thigh and groin height, the standard infantry strike, and stepped over the falling. On the flanks, the cavalry moved in arcs, not driving the center but circling, cutting off retreat, working the edges of the dissolving rebel mass where the fighters were already collapsing from exhaustion and the non-combatants were scattering into the open ground. This is where the ropes came out. Not blade work, not javelin throws. Ropes. Arms seized from horseback, hands forced behind backs, people driven to the ground by weight and number. The sound on the flanks was a different sound from the sound at the center. The center sounded like war. The flanks sounded like something older, like the morning, 2 years before, when men just like these had arrived at estates with the same efficiency, and lives had ended without ending, in the space of an hour. Crassus had his scribes on the battlefield. This detail appears across the ancient sources and has unsettled commentators for 2,000 years. The accounting desks set up at the field's edge, clerks recording tallies as groups of captives were herded past, the wax tablets propped on portable cases, the same way they would have been propped in a market stall in the forum. The image only feels grotesque if you assume Crassus saw this as a battle. He did not. He saw it as a liquidation event. The scribes were not present to record history. They were present to close out the position. Each captured body became a line entry. Each line entry was a financial decision still pending. Market value, physical condition, assigned category, recommended disposition. The plain held tens of thousands of corpses by the time the swords stopped moving. The rebel force had peaked at around 120,000 by some ancient counts, dropped severely through starvation and the earlier breakout fighting, and the final engagement consumed most of what was left of the fighting strength. Spartacus died somewhere inside that mass. No one found him. No one was looking particularly hard because the actual operational objective, the capture of a viable quantity of human assets, and the collection of enough surviving bodies to execute the punishment design Crassus had already drafted, did not require identifying a single corpse out of the heap. Pompey, marching south from the Alps, intercepted a body of roughly 5,000 rebel fugitives who had escaped the field and slaughtered them in a separate engagement. He then wrote to the Senate claiming that while Crassus had defeated the slaves in pitched battle, he himself had pulled the war up by its roots. Plutarch preserves the line. Crassus never forgave it. What the scribes catalogued by sundown was, in the figure most consistently preserved across the sources, 6,000 people. 6,000 bound, breathing, surviving rebels, men and women, veteran fighters, and untrained ones, people who had carried spears and people who had carried the water for the spear carriers, midwives, smiths, foragers, mothers carrying infants still suckling, all of them in a column under Roman guard, all of them passing the accounting tables row by row while Crassus's clerks worked the entries. This is the moment to look at the shelf below the video, because the depth of what you are watching right now rests on serious scholarship, and the source book that grounds this investigation is available through the View Products button on your screen. It is the kind of monolithic archive of the Roman world that takes years to compile and reads, like the author actually walked the roads from Capua to the Strait of Messina before writing a line. If you want to understand the financial machinery of Roman slavery, Not just the dramatic surface, but the ledgers underneath it. That book is where you go next. The shelf also carries themed pieces from this era. Imperial-style relics for the kind of viewer who keeps history in arm's reach instead of behind glass in a museum 2 cities away. Open the shelf. Look at what is there. The story continues, but the shelf is worth your minute. Now, back to the field and the 6,000 entries in Crassus's ledger. The problem was the same problem he had faced the morning after the Silurus engagement. These were not viable market assets. 2 years of war, a winter of starvation behind a wall, and the violence of the final battle had left most of these people in conditions a Roman slave dealer would assess and decline to bid on. Malnourished, injured, mentally torn in the specific way people are torn when they have spent 2 years free and woken up in chains again. Defiant in the way malnourished, injured people are defiant when they have nothing left to lose. Selling them through the regular markets would do 2 things Crassus could not afford. It would crash slave prices across Italy, gutting the very asset values he had just spent a fortune defending, and it would scatter 6,000 documented rebels into households across the Republic, where each one would carry, inside their head, the memory of what resistance had looked like, what it had felt like, what it had briefly achieved. Defiance moves the way fire moves. Crassus knew this. He had built his fortune in part on understanding how ideas about value, about risk, about what was possible, traveled through populations. A slave who had once been free did not forget. A slave who had once stood in a formation of 100,000 did not forget that numbers were a form of power. You could not place that slave in a Roman kitchen and expect the household ledger to stay quiet. Tacitus, writing more than a century later, would observe in the annals that the Romans had never developed a foolproof method for marking the difference between a free man and a slave on sight. A debate in the Senate had once proposed distinctive dress for slaves, and had been voted down on the grounds that the slaves, seeing their own numbers, might find courage they currently lacked. The Roman patrician class understood, in private, exactly what they were sitting on. The regular market was closed. 2 doors remained: destruction, or something else. He chose something else. What happened first was spectacle. The sources record that a portion of the captured women were condemned to die in the arena before the main installation began. The Romans had a term for it: damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. Women were brought onto the sand and killed in front of crowds by lions imported through Ostia, by bears trapped in the forests of the Apennines, by wild boars driven into the ring with hot irons. The appetite of the Roman public for this kind of viewing was not an accident of culture. It was structural. The relationship of the Roman citizen to violence as entertainment had been bred across generations, and the munera and venation, gladiatorial games and beast hunts, were the mechanism through which the ruling class managed civic emotion, redirected economic frustration, and demonstrated, in the most legible way available, the absolute authority of the state over the life of the body. Crassus needed to manage civic emotion. 2 years of slave rebellion marching back and forth across Italy had done something to the Roman public mind that the Senate could read on the faces of the crowd in the Forum. Cicero, in a speech delivered a few years later, recalled the panic of those months, the way Roman matrons had wept in the streets at the news of each fresh defeat, the way the price of grain had spiked, the way men of property had begun arming their household slaves and then immediately regretted doing so because arming the people you were afraid of solved nothing. The rebels had won battles. They had taken eagles. They had demonstrated in front of everyone that the system the Republic ran on was not invulnerable to the people held inside it. The public needed the ending of that story, shown to them clearly, viscerally, with enough force to burn the closing image into memory. The damnatio ad bestias was the opening act. There is evidence across the imperial sources for the staging of mythological reenactments in such events. A woman bound to the back of a wild bull and dragged and gored in pantomime of the death of Dirce, killed in the myth by Amphion and Zethus for the torment of their mother, Antiope. Martial, writing under Domitian, would describe such a reenactment in his book on the Flavian Games. The mythological framing did not soften what the crowd saw. It amplified it. It told the audience, this is not random violence. This is justice operating at the level of divine narrative. The gods themselves approve. The beasts are instruments of cosmological order. Watch. The crowd watched. They went home. They talked about what they had seen in the bathhouses, in the wine shops, at the dinner tables in the Subura, where the slaves serving the meals overheard every word and folded those words into their own private accounting of what life under a Roman roof actually was. The message moved outward in every direction simultaneously, and the main installation had not yet begun. The Via Appia was not chosen by accident. The practical case was real. A paved road running just over 200 miles between Capua and Rome was the most efficient corridor available for moving 6,000 prisoners and the legionaries required to manage them. But the practical case was not why Crassus chose it. The Via Appia was the most prestigious road in the Republic. It was called the Regina Viarum, the Queen of Roads. The censor Appius Claudius Caecus had laid the first section in 312 BC, paving it in basalt blocks fitted so tightly that no blade could enter the joints. Consuls had marched armies south along its stones. Generals returning in triumph from the conquest of Tarentum and from the wars against Pyrrhus had ridden their chariots north along it. It was the artery through which Roman military power flowed south, and through which the wealth of the southern provinces, wine, oil, fish sauce, grain, slaves, flowed back north. Every merchant, every diplomat, every traveler moving between the capital and the south passed along that road. Every slave driving a cart of amphorae, every slave walking beside a litter, every slave moving between a Campanian estate and a market stall in Rome. Crassus was choosing his billboard. He was not executing 6,000 people. He was constructing an installation that would be viewed by millions in the weeks it remained standing. He was investing in infrastructure, the infrastructure of fear, and the Via Appia delivered the highest possible return on that investment in terms of audience reach. Each cross was a message. The sequence of crosses, 200 miles of them, was not a message. It was a communication system, a network of signals, each one reinforcing the last, each one positioned to be visible from the road, in a way that could not be ignored and could not be processed quickly enough for the viewer to grow numb before the next one came into view. Before the crosses went up, the scourging happened. The Roman flagrum was a short wooden handle ending in multiple leather thongs. At the working end of each thong, the military version, the version used for judicial purposes, carried weighted attachments, lead balls, bone splinters, small iron fragments. The effect of the flagrum on a human back was not the effect of a blade. A sword cut, properly dressed, can be managed. The flagrum tears. It peels. It leaves a surface that is not wounded in any surgical sense, but processed. Skin, and the tissue beneath it macerated. The back of a person after a full scourging, resembling less an injured body, and more something that has passed through a piece of machinery. The Latin word for this preliminary punishment was verberatio, and it served a specific function inside the crucifixion protocol. It accelerated death. A man placed on a cross without prior scourging could survive on that cross for several days. Cassius Dio records cases lasting longer. A man placed on a cross after a full verberatio was already dying when the nails went in. The blood loss had already begun. The shock to the body's organ systems was compounding. The cross would close out what the whip had opened, more quickly and more visibly, because a body in the acute phase of dying communicates more clearly to an audience than a body in the slow phase of a death that takes days to declare itself. Crassus needed these deaths legible across a sustained timeline. Days, not hours. He needed the crosses still occupied, still carrying living bodies, because a corpse on a cross transmits a different message than a person on one. At the moment, the maximum traffic of viewers passed beneath them. The scourging was calibrated to that timing. The verberatio was pre-processing. It prepared the raw material for installation. The squads worked in rotation. The ancient sources do not preserve a Latin term for the unit that managed crucifixions at this industrial scale, and any term assigned to them is modern interpolation. But the organizational shape is implicit in the scale of the operation. 6,000 people, 200 miles of road. You do not deliver that with improvisation. You deliver it with teams assigned to sections, with a logistical chain bringing timber down from the forests of the Apennines and iron spikes, and the nails driven through the bones of the wrist and the bones of the foot were not small hardware. They were iron stakes the length of a man's palm, with supply caravans hauling water and bread for the soldiers running the operation. Carpenters were attached to the columns to cut the patibulum, the crossbeam each victim was forced to carry to the site of their own erection. Smiths traveled with portable forges to reshape damaged nails and replace bent ones. Crassus had just demonstrated, with the 35-mile wall, that he could deliver large-scale construction under pressure. He applied the same discipline here. The crosses went up in sequence. The spacing was regular. Appian's geometry gives roughly one cross every 100 feet across 200 miles, which is the figure required to seat 6,000 crucifixions along that distance. The bodies faced the road. This was not incidental. A cross can be angled toward open country, toward a field, away from human traffic. Crassus did not do this. Every face was turned toward the road. Every person nailed to those crosses spent the final hours of their life looking at the traffic passing below them. And the travelers below were physically unable to avoid the eyes coming back at them from the wood above. This is where the crucifixion of the women requires a separate accounting, because it was not simply more of the same arithmetic. It was a different category of statement. Roman society organized its understanding of social order through the household. The familia, the unit of father, mother, children, dependents, slaves, all held together under the absolute legal authority of the paterfamilias. Slaves were, in legal theory, members of the familia, disordered members, members without rights, members whose personhood was legally erased, but members. The ideological framework of Roman slavery was not purely economic. It was familial. The slave belonged to the household, in the same structural sense as the master's children belonged to it. The household was the foundational cell of Roman civilization, and the slave's role inside it was defined by that architecture. The rebellion had produced, in its more radical interior, an alternative household. Men and women who had been property had built partnerships. They had had children together. They had created, inside the moving column of the army, something that functioned like a family. Not the Roman familia with its legal apparatus, but the raw human structure underneath the law. The attachment of people to each other built on nothing except shared history and shared survival. Plutarch records that Spartacus himself had been married or attached, to a Thracian woman of his own people who had escaped Capua with him in the original breakout. She was a prophetess, Plutarch says, a follower of the Dionysian mysteries, and she had read his future in the snake she had once seen coiled around his face while he slept. She had walked at his side through every campaign. She was somewhere in the column moving up the Via Appia under Roman guard in the spring of 71 BC. Crassus understood this because he understood people as assets, and he understood that the attachment between two people was itself a form of asset, a motivation, a commitment, a thing that made a person act in ways pure self-interest could not predict. The women in the rebel camp had not been peripheral. They had been the connective tissue. They were the reason men who were starving and outnumbered had stayed in the line another morning. They were the reason the army had not dissolved into individual flight when the wall went up. They were the reason Spartacus's force had held coherence through 2 years of constant motion and constant fear. Put the mothers on the crosses. Put the wives on the crosses. Put the daughters on the crosses. Not as punishment for what they had done, because in Crassus's accounting, punishment was never the operating variable. Put them up as a message about what the future would look like if this happened again. Not just death for the fighters. Death for the women who had carried their water. Death for the children who had been born in the camp. Death for the entire generative capacity of resistance. The erasure not just of this rebellion, but of the biological possibility of any rebellion growing from the same roots. Every slave in Italy who passed along the Via Appia in the weeks that followed would see something beyond execution. They would see the future their master had set aside for them if they ever picked up a kitchen knife and walked out of a ludus gate. Not just their own death, the death of everyone they had brought into the world, or might bring into the world. The deletion of their entire line from the public record in the most protracted, most visible, most impossible to ignore form Roman technology could manufacture. This was the product Crassus was making. Not corpses. Fear. A particular grade of fear. The kind that fastens itself not to the self, but to the people the self loves. The kind that says, it is not enough to be brave on your own behalf, because your bravery will be paid for by your children. That fear does not behave like ordinary fear. It does not burn out. It does not fade when the immediate threat passes. It breeds. It transmits. It becomes part of the texture of a community's understanding of what is possible and what is not. What actions are survivable, and which actions write your descendants off the ledger. Crassus had identified the exact mechanism by which the slave population of Italy could be made to maintain its own captivity. Not through surveillance, not through chains, not through locks on the doors at night, but through a shared inherited understanding that the cost of resistance was not personal. It was collective. It was generational. It was paid by people not yet born. He was manufacturing that understanding at a cost of 6,000 lives. The road stretched south from the gates of Rome toward Capua. The carts rolled north under the rows of crosses. The crows came in from the wheat fields outside Aricia and settled along the cross beams in numbers Roman travelers later described as biblical. The scribes had folded their wax tablets shut. The books were closed. The figures were final. And on a cross somewhere along the 73rd mile out from Rome, a woman who had been a midwife in the rebel camp, who had pulled 3 infants alive from the bodies of laboring mothers in the snow of Brutium that February, opened her eyes against the morning light and saw, walking up the road below her in a Roman tunic, holding the hand of a man she did not recognize, a small boy whose face she had pulled into the world herself 11 months earlier. The first cross went up before dawn. Crassus did not watch from a distance. The ancient sources place him in the vicinity of the operation's opening, not supervising the placement of nails or the angling of crossbeams because that work belonged to engineers and centurions, but present in the way a man is present at the opening of a structure he has financed. No speech survives, no record of a triumphal proclamation, no sacrifice to Jupiter Optimus Maximus on a portable altar, no haruspex reading entrails to confirm divine approval. Only the work, beginning in the cold gray light before the sun cleared the Apennines, the sound of mallets striking iron into pine, the sound of the heads of those mallets coming down in a rhythm that carried across the flat country alongside the road, in the quiet before the daily traffic began. He had solved his problem. That is the only frame through which this morning makes sense as a historical event. Every other frame, justice, vengeance, Roman virtue, the punishment of rebellion against the state, is retrospective packaging applied by historians writing decades and centuries later for audiences who needed the event to mean something other than what it was. What it was, at its origin, at the moment Crassus signed off on the design and his engineers began laying out the intervals along the road with measuring cords and survey poles, was the closing entry in a financial dilemma that had no clean answer in any ledger he knew how to read. 6,000 people who could not be sold, could not be fed, could not be released. 6,000 entries demanding a final disposition. He had found one. The deaths were the manufacturing cost. The return was what the deaths produced. The first travelers on the Via Appia that morning were merchants. They always were. Commercial traffic moved early, before the heat. The carts loaded with Campanian pottery from the workshops at Celles and Suessa, amphorae of Falernian wine sealed with pitch, sacks of emmer wheat from the Volturnus Valley. The donkeys were patient and slow on the basalt blocks, the drivers half asleep on their benches above the wheels, familiar with every mile of a road they had traveled dozens of times. They knew the road the way a man knows the route between his home and his shop, without thinking, because thinking was no longer necessary. They knew the milestone at the 8th mile out from Capua, cut with the name of Appius Claudius Coccus, the censor who had laid the first stones of this road in 312 BC during a quarrel with the Senate about the building of a new aqueduct. They knew the bend near the Pontine marshes, where the road ran beside an old drainage canal and the footing slipped after rain. They knew which roadside taverns watered their wine and which served it honest. They rounded the first bend after Capua and found out they did not know the road at all. The crosses were not improvised. The timber had been cut and shaped in advance, hauled down from the forests above Caudium and Beneventum on ox carts requisitioned by Crassus's officers from the surrounding estates. The uprights came pre-notched to receive the patibulum, the crossbeam, fitted in the standard Roman construction the army carpenters knew from their manuals. The whole installation had been engineered for rapid assembly by squads that had been issued clear specifications and given enough drill to work without hesitation. The interval was disciplined, roughly every 100 feet, near enough that a traveler moving at walking pace would never be out of sight of at least one cross, and never more than a short distance from the next. The road did not pass through the installation. The installation was the road. You could not travel the Via Appia from Capua to Rome that spring without spending your entire journey inside it. The merchants stopped their carts. Some turned back. Others did not turn back because they could not afford to. The inland routes through the Apennines were longer. The tolls on the alternative roads cut into margins already thin, and commerce in the late Republic did not stop for anything. Not even this. They pressed forward. They drove their wheels between the rows of crosses with their eyes fixed on the basalt, under the donkeys and the sounds of the dying coming down on either side. and they arrived in Rome having absorbed, into the deepest layer of their nervous systems, a message that no edict, no public pronouncement from the rostra, no decree of the Senate engraved in bronze could have delivered with equivalent force. Word moved faster than the carts. By the time the first travelers reached the wine shops along the Tiber wharves and the bread stalls in the Argoletum and described what they had seen, the information was already changing shape. Not losing accuracy, but acquiring texture, picking up the specific details that make a story transmit through a population the way a fever transmits through a barracks. Not just crosses. Crosses for 200 miles. Not just rebels. Women. Children. People still alive on them. Still moving. The number 6,000 passed from mouth to mouth and bent in the telling. Not because Romans were dishonest, but because a number that large does not fit inside the imagination without expanding to fill the room available. Cicero himself, who was practicing law in Rome that year and would later defend Sextus Roscius in a notorious parricide case, would refer in later speeches to the crucifixion as a punishment so terrible that the very word should be kept far from the eyes, ears, and minds of Roman citizens. He knew the word. He had seen the road that summer. Every slave in Rome heard. Every slave who had carried a litter, served a wine cup, washed a master's feet, slept in a corridor outside a master's bedroom, they all heard, because they were the people serving the meals at which the story was told. And they had ears, and the people doing the telling did not always remember they had ears. In the kitchen of a senator's house on the Palatine, a cook who had been brought to Rome from Bithynia 12 years earlier listened to a diner from Capua describe the 72nd mile and continued, without breaking rhythm, to slice onions for the next course. The specific terror of what the women experienced on those crosses requires a kind of attention the ancient sources do not fully provide, because the ancient sources were not written by women or by slaves. What we have instead is the medical and structural record of crucifixion as a method, a record that is, in its clinical precision, more disturbing than any dramatic narration could manufacture. The position of crucifixion is not static. The body, nailed through the wrists between the radius and the ulna, where the bones support the weight without tearing through the tissue, and nailed through the feet or the ankles depending on the local practice of the executioner, hangs in a configuration that forces a continuous, exhausting negotiation between two threats to survival: asphyxiation, cardiovascular collapse. The weight of the body pulling down compresses the chest cavity, making exhaling possible but inhaling difficult. To breathe in, the crucified person must push upward against the nails through the feet, taking their full weight on a pierced joint to expand the chest enough to draw air. The push upward, the intake of breath, the slow sag back down. This is the repeating cycle of crucifixion. It continues until the person can no longer push upward. At that point, breathing stops. This is not a quick process. In a person who has undergone prior scourging, whose blood volume is already reduced, whose body is already in shock from trauma and dehydration, the cycle accelerates and failure comes on the first day or sometimes the first night. In a person whose scourging was lighter or whose physical resilience was unusual, the cycle can continue for days. Josephus, writing a century later about the siege of Jerusalem under Titus, would describe crosses where the victims survived 3 days, 4 days, before the soldiers grew bored and finished them. Roman soldiers carried the crurifragium, the breaking of the legs with an iron bar, as a method of acceleration when the spectacle had served its purpose, or when the soldier managing a particular cross needed to clear his section before nightfall. Breaking the legs removed the ability to push upward. Breathing stopped within minutes. Crassus did not order the crurifragium on the first day. The crosses were meant to be occupied for the maximum legible duration. The women who had spent 2 years keeping the rebel army alive, the foragers, the smiths, the midwives, the mothers, spent their last hours doing the one thing the body does when it still has the reflex of survival. Pushing up against the nails to breathe, not because they had hope, not because they expected anything, because the lungs demand air regardless of what the mind knows, and the body continues its negotiation with death until it physically cannot continue. Sweat ran down the inside of the wood. Flies came at sunrise. The crows took the eyes first, because the eyes are soft tissue and the birds work by efficiency. The road traffic passed. The merchants, the legionary couriers carrying dispatches between the capital and the southern garrisons, the diplomats in their curtained litters with their slave-bearers walking under the poles, the freedmen returning to family estates, the tax collectors, and the contract bidders on their way to public auctions at Capua and Brundisium. The ones in the litters had the option of pulling the curtains closed. Some did. The slaves walking the road in the open had no curtains. There is a calculation embedded in the specific choice to crucify the women that reaches past spectacle into the architecture of a slave society that most of Crassus's contemporaries felt but could not articulate. A slave society does not maintain itself through force alone. The Roman Republic had no police in any modern sense. There was no standing patrol watching the slave population, no surveillance network capable of tracking 3 million people across the length of Italy, no centralized registry that could even tell the state how many slaves lived in any given region in any given year. The aediles patrolled the markets. The Tresviri capitals handled night arrests inside the city walls. Beyond that, the system relied on the master. What maintained order across 3 million enslaved people was compliance. The daily, constant individual decision made by each of them to not resist this morning. That decision was not freely made in any meaningful sense. It was produced by a combination of immediate personal risk, uncertainty about outcomes, isolation of individuals from each other across language and origin, and the inability to imagine a realistic alternative to the life inside the master's house. The Spartacus rebellion had assaulted every one of those factors. It had demonstrated that resistance was possible. It had demonstrated that numbers could overcome the personal risk calculation. It had connected isolated individuals across regions, across languages, Thracians, Gauls, Germans, Africans, Italians born inside the system, into a force large enough to defeat Roman armies in pitched battle and strip them of their eagles. It had demonstrated, with 2 years of operation, that an alternative existed, that there was a life, however hard, however brief, in which a person who had been property was not property anymore. Crassus could not undemonstrate those things. He could not delete 2 years from the collective memory of 3 million people. What he could do was change the calculation attached to the memory. He could not make slaves forget that resistance had been tried, but he could ensure that what they remembered about its ending was specific enough, and graphic enough, and comprehensive enough that the memory of the ending outweighed the memory of everything that had come before it. The women on the crosses targeted the deepest pressure point available. A person willing to risk their own death for freedom may not be willing to risk their children's. A person willing to absorb personal suffering may not be willing to watch the people they love absorb the same. The Roman slave system depended, in a way it never fully articulated even to itself, on the slave's emotional investment in the people around them. The Verna children, the partners formed inside the household, the friends made in conditions of shared suffering. Crassus was using those attachments as levers, long iron levers driven through the joints of the people who held the system together. The message was structural. Your rebellion cost you everything. But more than that, it cost the people you brought into the world. Look at the road. Look at what happens to them. Now return to your master's kitchen and make your calculation again, and make it with this new information. That message held. Not for a year. Not for a generation. The Third Servile War was the last large-scale slave rebellion in the Roman world. There were individual revolts. There were minor uprisings on specific estates, runaways and brigands, and the persistent low-grade resistance that any slave society produces and absorbs. Tacitus records the Pedanius Secundus affair under Nero in AD 61, when 400 slaves were executed for the murder of a single prefect. The crowd nearly rioted against the executions, and Nero had to line the route with soldiers. There were always pressures. But no rebellion at the scale of Spartacus rose again in Italy. Not under the late Republic. Not under Augustus. Not under any emperor of the 1st century, the 2nd, the 3rd. The conditions did not improve. The slave population did not become reconciled. The recalibration of risk that Crassus delivered through 6,000 crucifixions held for roughly a century and a half of Roman history, and arguably longer. 6,000 lives. A century and a half of stability. From a pure return on investment perspective, it was one of the most efficient expenditures in the financial history of the ancient world. This is the fact at the bottom of the story, and it is the hardest fact to sit with. Because it suggests that the logic worked, that the calculation was correct, that Crassus, standing beside the road in the spring light, watching the first crosses go up, was right in the most disturbing way a human being can be right. Factually, strategically, financially right. About what 6,000 deaths could purchase. Pompey arrived late. He had been in Hispania finishing the war against the Marian commander Quintus Sertorius, a guerrilla campaign that had consumed Roman manpower for nearly a decade in the rough country of the Iberian Peninsula. Sertorius had been assassinated in 73 BC by his own officer Marcus Perperna at a banquet, stabbed at the dinner table the way Roman generals were always stabbed in the late Republic, over a cup of wine, by a man who had been smiling at him an hour earlier. Pompey crushed Perperna in turn, executed him, and marched his legions back across the Alps in the spring of 71 BC. He encountered the scattered survivors of the rebel force who had broken through Crassus's wall before the final battle. Plutarch puts the number around 5,000. Pompey's cavalry ran them down in the open country of Etruria, somewhere in the rolling territory between the Apennines and the coast, and killed them on the spot. He then wrote his famous letter to the Senate. Crassus had won the battle, the letter said, but Pompey had pulled the war up by the roots. Crassus read that letter with the expression of a man who has just watched another man take a coin from a table he had built with his own money. The two men detested each other with a professional precision that was almost admirable. Pompey was everything Crassus was not. Physically magnetic, his short blonde hair styled in deliberate imitation of Alexander the Great, beloved by his soldiers, the kind of general whose troops would follow him into any catastrophe because he made catastrophe feel heroic. Crassus was the kind of man who made heroism feel unnecessary because he had already run the numbers and determined that the outcome was achievable without it. Where Pompey attracted loyalty through personality, Crassus secured it through the ledger. These two grammars of power had been generating friction between them for years, and the closing campaign of the slave war gave them a stage on which the friction was performed in front of the entire Republic. Rome gave them both honors, not equal honors. Pompey received a full triumph. The formal procession through the city, with his army marching behind him, and the spoils of Hispania carried in front. The wreath of laurel pressed against his head by a slave whispering the ritual words, Respis post te, hominem te memento. Look behind you. Remember you are mortal. Crassus was offered only an ovation, the lesser ceremony, on the grounds that his victory had been over slaves and not over a foreign enemy. The protocol distinction drew a line that Crassus found insulting, in the way only a man who measures everything can find a distinction insulting, precisely, exactly, with the full weight of what it cost him. He pushed back through a legal technicality. He requested permission to wear the laurel wreath instead of the standard myrtle of an ovation, on the grounds that the rebellion had been a true war and not a mere uprising. The Senate granted it. The grant was a face-saving gesture, and everyone in the Senate knew it. He accepted. He walked through Rome wearing laurel he had argued for in committee, on foot rather than in a chariot, and the crowds cheered because the war was over, and they were glad of it. Somewhere behind his expression was the accounting of everything he was owed and would never receive full credit for. He went back to his investments. In the same year of his ovation, Crassus held the consulship jointly with Pompey. The two men served together for 12 months, sharing the highest magistracy of the Republic, while barely speaking to each other in private. They reconciled publicly at the end of their term in a staged ceremony. A senator named Gaius Aurelius reportedly stood up in the assembly and claimed Jupiter had visited him in a dream, demanding the two consuls embrace before laying down their fasces. They embraced. The crowd applauded. The hatred underneath continued to compound at interest. The crosses stood for weeks. The ancient sources do not give a precise date for when they came down, whether by official order, whether by the road crews who maintained the Via Appia under the Cura Viarum, whether the weather and the birds and the slow processes of decomposition were allowed to resolve the question without intervention. What the sources do tell us is that the road did not return quickly to its ordinary character. The installation persisted. It remained a physical fact of the territory between Capua and Rome long enough to be seen by the maximum available audience, which was the operational objective. The bodies decomposed in the order physiology dictated. The birds were not patient. Crows from the wheat country around Aricia and Velitrae moved in along the crossbeams. The kites came down from the Alban hills. In the Italian summer, and this was spring turning into summer, the days lengthening, the temperatures climbing, the process was not slow. But the precise condition of the organic material stopped mattering after a certain point, because the crosses themselves carried the message. And a cross with a skeleton is still a cross. The message was structural, not biological. It was built into the landscape. You could not unsee it by waiting for flesh to disappear, because the timber remained, and the iron remained, and the geometry of one cross every 100 feet for 200 miles remained as a fact about the territory you were traveling through. Roman engineers had built a monument, not to victory, to price. The price of disobedience, denominated in human beings, displayed at full scale along the most prestigious road in the Republic. Marcus Licinius Crassus went on to become one of the three most powerful men in the late Republic. His alliance with Julius Caesar and Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, the arrangement historians call the First Triumvirate, formed in 60 BC at a private meeting in Rome that was never written down on any document the Senate could subpoena, was the financial engine that funded the political careers of both his partners and extended his own grip into the highest reaches of Roman politics. He served as consul twice, in 70 BC alongside Pompey, and again in 55 BC alongside Pompey. For a second time, both consulships negotiated through the arithmetic of his wealth and his partner's soldiers. He held mortgages on the estates of half the Roman aristocracy. Plutarch records that Crassus once observed, in the casual cruelty he reserved for dinner conversation, that no man could call himself rich who could not maintain a legion from his own income. He could maintain 7. The calculation was unwritten, and everyone knew it. He died in 53 BC at the Battle of Karhai, in a Mesopotamian desert near the modern Turkish-Syrian frontier, in one of the worst military catastrophes in Roman history. 7 legions, raised with his own money, equipped to his own specification, marched east against the Parthian Empire on his own initiative against the explicit objections of the tribune Attius Capito, who had laid a curse on the expedition at the city gate as the army marched out, were annihilated by Parthian cavalry under the general Surena. The engagement has been studied for 2,000 years as a case in overconfidence colliding with terrain a Roman army was not built to fight on. The horse archers of Surena had been resupplied with arrows from a camel train kept just behind the battle line, and the arrows did not run out. The legionaries locked their shields into the testudo formation and waited for the volleys to stop, and the volleys did not stop. Crassus's son Publius, who had served under Julius Caesar in Gaul and brought 1,000 Gallic cavalry with him east, led a charge to break out of the encirclement, was cut off in the open desert, and ordered his own bodyguard to kill him rather than be taken alive. His head was brought back to the Parthian lines and held up on a spear within sight of his father before the main collapse began. Crassus himself was killed during a failed negotiation under flag of truce. The sources differ on the exact sequence, whether he was stabbed by a Parthian officer named Pomaxithres, whether he was killed by one of his own men named Octavius to spare him capture, whether he died in the confusion of a brawl that broke out when his interpreter mistranslated a phrase about the formal handover of weapons. What is not disputed is that he died in the dust, far from his ledgers, far from his accounting tables, far from the Via Appia. His head was cut off and sent to the Parthian court at Seleucia, where Plutarch reports it was used as a prop in a performance of Euripides' Bacchae, held up at the moment in the play when the chorus enters carrying the head of Pentheus, torn apart by his own mother in a fit of Dionysian frenzy. The actor playing Agave received applause for his improvisation. The Parthian king Orodes IV, Hanni Tual Setintu, was reportedly delighted. The man who had turned 6,000 deaths into a state advertisement was himself turned into a stage property in someone else's entertainment. Cassius Dio preserves the further detail, though historians debate its accuracy, that the Parthians poured molten gold into his severed mouth, a posthumous comment on his famous appetite for wealth. Whether the detail is literal history or moralist embellishment, the writers of the empire preserved it because it carried the kind of symmetry their audiences expected from the fate of a man like Crassus. He had measured everything in coin. He died with coin in his throat. The eagles of his 7 legions were carried back to the Parthian capital and displayed in the temple precincts for a generation, until Augustus negotiated their return in 20 BC as part of a diplomatic settlement that he then commemorated on the Prima Porta statue as one of the great achievements of his reign. Roman soldiers captured at Karhai were resettled by the Parthians as garrison troops on the eastern frontier of the empire, where some sources, controversial and debated, place their descendants as far east as the Chinese border. The Via Appia outlasted him by centuries. Travelers walked that road under Augustus, under Trajan, under Constantine. The road was maintained, resurfaced, extended. New milestones were added. The history of individual miles was overwritten by the traffic of centuries, the way a chalk mark on a stone floor is eventually worn away by enough feet passing over it. But the road also kept a record. Every major event that touched it left something behind. In the architecture along its margins, in the tombs and temples and warehouses crowding its first few miles outside the city, in the accounts of travelers who recorded what they saw moving between Capua and Rome. The record of 71 BC was part of that account. Appian preserved it in his civil wars. Plutarch preserved it in the life of Crassus. Florus, writing his epitome of Roman history in the 2nd century AD, preserved it. Orosius, writing under Augustine in the 5th century, when the Western Empire was collapsing under barbarian pressure, still cited the 6,000 as a benchmark of state violence against which other atrocities could be measured. The number, the road, the spacing, the length. These details carried their own weight across the imperial centuries. What no Roman writer recorded, because they had no access to it, because the people involved left no inscriptions and built no monuments, was what the slaves who walked that road in the weeks after the installation took away with them. What was said in the sleeping quarters of the urban domus that summer, in the kitchens, in the weaving rooms, in the dark of the warehouses after the last oil lamp was extinguished, what parents whispered to children, what was passed by oral transmission into the next generation and the one after, changing shape in transit, losing specific detail, and keeping essential structure the way all transmitted memory works. The detail it almost certainly kept, the one that needed no elaboration to remain legible across generations, was this. They put the women up too, not just the fighters, not just the men who had carried weapons, the women, the whole family, the whole future, every stake any of them had in the world. This was Crassus's final invoice, submitted to the slave population of Italy, payable in permanent psychological restructuring with compound interest in the form of inherited fear. The invoice did not expire. It was designed not to expire. The whole point was duration. 6,000 souls, 200 miles of road, a century and a half of relative quiet in a system that should, by every rational calculation, have torn itself apart long before that. The accountant got his return. Thank you for staying with this one to the end. If this investigation gave you something, a new lens on what Roman power actually was, what it cost, who paid for it, share it with someone who needs to see it. Subscribe if you have not already. Hit like so this story reaches the people it deserves to reach. The history of the Roman world is too dark and too important to leave to soft tellings, and the support of viewers like you is what keeps work at this level alive on this channel. The next video is already waiting on your screen. Click it now. The descent continues there. You have just watched another premium documentary by Romanus, your home of the Roman Empire on YouTube.